Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Cindy Prizio. I'm the Executive Director of One Standard of Justice, a volunteer-based civil rights organization. I'm delighted to see so many of you here who are interested in learning about a successful restorative justice program. I believe if you are on this call, like me, you too believe change is possible. The format for tonight's event is this. I'll introduce our co-sponsor, Senator Gary Winfield, for his opening comments. Next, I'll introduce a short video from the Washington, D.C. Office of the Attorney General depicting their early work going back probably to 2016. Then we will go to our featured speaker, Seema Gajwani. During the presentation and after, you can place your questions or comments in the Q&A feature. Q&A will begin immediately following the presentation, and Seema will be joined by Senator Winfield. We will not be using the chat for questions. On a future note, we'd just like to share with you, Seema will be back with us on January 25th. And our very next webinar is on January 5th, featuring Jenny Coleman from Stop It Now. I want to share with you a story. I was speaking to some of the legislators yesterday, and I received a call from a state senator. He said he had been thinking about me over the past couple of days. He went on to say he'd listened to a radio show about a tree lighting in a town in Texas that had enacted a little theater. At the tree lighting ceremony, the police, this was all staged, arrested the Grinch. The senator was disturbed by this message. He felt it sent the wrong message to both children and adults. He would have liked to see the restorative story told. The Grinch, a curmudgeonly dude, stole all the holiday presents and food, ended up remorseful, and returned the stolen items. In the final scene, we see the connection between the Grinch and the who's who's sitting at a table together, enjoying a beast feast. What harm was done, who was harmed, and what needs to be done to repair it. And finally, repair of harm requires the human connection, or in this case, the beastly connection. I thank the senator who has a gift for illustration. In fact, I use many of his stories in public speaking. I tell this story before introducing Senator Winfield, who in my mind is one of the best storytellers I've ever heard. He is a Renaissance man, a husband, father, advocate, mentor, photographer, storyteller, and by the way, I just learned yesterday, illustrator of children's books. I call him friend and thank him for his role in validating the necessity of and participating in the difficult conversations. Call to action, Senator. I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Cindy. I was beginning to wonder where you were going with the Grinch story. I saw that as well. Good evening to everyone who's on the call. I'm happy you're here. One of the best parts about the Grinch story is that his heart grows 3 times, right? But I'm happy you're here because we've been having a conversation about restorative justice in the state for a long time. And we have some programs that have what we call restorative practice, but we don't really do restorative justice the way that it could be done to the benefit of the state. So I'm happy that Cindy asked me to join with her and be a part of having this conversation. I've seen Seema speak. I think you're in for a good conversation. I implore everyone to really participate and ask the questions in the short period of time we have. And look, what I know is this: our justice system is not designed to give us what we need. It's not designed to think about human beings and what they need when something that puts us in contact with the justice system happens. I've been a victim of crime myself. And I know that really wasn't about what do I need, it was about how does the system function and do we check the boxes of what we are supposed to be doing. But that's not how human beings work. And sometimes what we need is not for someone to be in prison or to have a record or any of that stuff. Sometimes we need to have a conversation with them. Sometimes we need some other things that our system can't give people. And so even though the system has functioned, people walk away and they don't have the things they need. They don't have the trust that they've lost. They can't figure out how to get there anymore. They don't feel security. They don't feel a lot of the things that we all know are the basic needs we have after one of these kind of events occur. So I'm really excited about the possibilities that come out of this conversation. I'm very thankful to Cindy and One Standard of Justice. And I'm thankful that we have Seema here. And I think when it's over, you will be too. Thank you, Cindy.
Okay, thanks, Senator Winfield. I'd like, without any further talk, to just get the video going. It's approximately 7 minutes long, and it's been condensed from a longer version.
The objective, I think, of the program in my mindset is that through this program, it really showed how families, people who don't know each other can come together, can reason together, and work out their own issues.
I am an attorney in DC. I represent both adults and juveniles charged with crime. I've been doing this kind of work for about 30 years. I find that my clients respond positively to the process, having the ability to be heard at the table, to discuss sort of what their version of what happened, how they were feeling about it. Restorative justice gives them an opportunity to sort of open up and talk about things on a wider scale. So it's good for them, I think.
When the families came together, we were seated in a circle, which I thought was really, really good, because it gave everyone a chance to just kind of open up and to face one another and to really deal with the issue at hand.
Help them. Sit down, talk to them. Let's talk it out. Let's see how we can get through this. Let's see how we can change our attitude and help each other so that we won't run into this kind of situation again.
Having them sit down and speak with a victim, hearing from a victim firsthand about how that victim went through the process, or what it meant to them to be robbed, to have property taken from them, to be physically assaulted. All of a sudden, the client can't help but feel some empathy, some responsibility. I have yet to have a client who has come out of this process and complained about it.
Also, it would give my son an opportunity to apologize for what he had done, and also kind of feel that regret, feel the regret for what he did, and to kind of talk about it and discuss why it happened in ways that it could have been avoided. And I feel like it was an excellent opportunity for him to really pull himself together, to recognize what he did and to pull himself together. And, he's still in the program, and since he's been in the program, he has shown tremendous maturity and improvement in school, in his relationships with family and friends. He knows what he did was wrong. He knows he doesn't want to go back down that road with the court system.
So I was a bit skeptical because I wasn't sure that victims truly would want to participate in this program or in restorative justice, because they have to basically face the person who committed the offense. I felt like it was also an easy way out for offenders as well. But what I've learned in my experience is that, one, for offenders, it is not an easy way out, because they do have to face this person who they've committed this harm against. It's not an easy thing to do, to admit that you're wrong. Well, to have power in a case for a victim is extremely important in my experience, because the offense started with them not having power and not having control. And then after the offense, they may still feel like they don't have that power and control. So restorative justice is a way for them to regain that power and that sense of control that they lost, which they can take with them moving forward.
I was just glad that you decided to have that circle, because at that point, it was an opportunity for her to express how she felt. Now, I know how she felt when she came home, and we talked about it just that one time. But when we had the meeting, when I heard all the things that she said, I was like, And I was shocked because that was the very first time that she's actually opened up and actually said how she felt. And I was proud of both of them because they both were receptive, they both understood, and then they both were even compassionate with each other.
I have found that there are many victims who are interested in participating in restorative justice. There are victims who say, before we even discuss restorative justice, they're like, is there an alternative to the traditional justice system? Not only are they seeking it, but even ones who may not have been familiar with it, and even those who participate in restorative justice and then they enter it skeptical, they leave out many times with a resolution that they are happy with.
A large portion of the cases involve the victim being someone they actually come in contact with on a regular basis. And part of that is just poor decision-making, poor coping skills on the part of the respondent, my client. They tend just not to know how to talk their way out of a problem, and they instinctively resort to the use of force or something like that. It's always gratifying as part of the Restorative Justice Program to see my client be able to repair a relationship with someone who they're going to be seeing on a consistent basis.
Yes, and at the end of the conference, we came in together, and it was a little anxiety, and but by the time we finished, when the conference was over, everyone was happy. It was like everyone felt confident that my son wouldn't do anything like that. They felt safe. Our kids still go to the same school. As a matter of fact, my son and the victim, they're friends now.
I'm Jason Dixon with Metro Transit Police, and I've been with the Transit Police for about 10 years, going on 11. At that point, I knew he was in a world of trouble because the charges that I was going to bring to the table, assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, these were big charges. This kid was going to go through the system, talk to his lawyer, see the judge, get whatever he gets, he goes out the door, now he has a record, and he does it all over again. And to me, 10 years in this system dealing with juveniles, that doesn't work. You have these cases of kids, if you could reach them early and let them talk to the victim, let them see the real damage they did, and then give them an opportunity to try to fix it. I needed this young man to look me in the eye, tell me why he did what he did, tell me if he was truly sorry. Really blew my mind. I'm like, this is the young man that put me in the hospital. And here we are conversating, talking, laughing, and I could bring him to my house, introduce him to my family, and wouldn't have a problem taking him to a cookout or something. And vice versa, and like I said, the regular way of doing things, you wouldn't have this result. You would have a bitter juvenile put through the system, still not understanding what he or she did wrong, and then probably going to repeat what they did because now they have a chip on their shoulder. This program is to me it's long overdue. It's something that has been needed for these kids for a long time.
Restorative justice, if it's handled properly, and if both parties buy into it, at the end of it, both parties walk out with the understanding that something bad happened, but amends have been made, and now we move forward. And this is a much better way when you're talking about repairing the community that you're seeing.
First of all, I want to say again that video was very early on the restorative justice units, probably first year of work. And it was put together to help promote what was so good about restorative justice. After we watched the video, it reminds me of my earlier work at the Capitol when I heard the former executive director of Court Support Services Division say these words, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Okay, next to our featured presenter. By the way, I asked Seema yesterday because while I'm getting to know her as a colleague, I don't know a lot about her personally. So I asked if she had ever been to Connecticut. She visited Branford, Connecticut, where a former roommate lived. So I'm hoping Senator Winfield will have reason to invite Seema to Connecticut one day soon. I met Seema when I first saw her presentation for the Annie Casey Foundation. I fell immediately, deeply and madly in love with the person and the message. Flash forward 2 or 3 years later, I happened to call the AG's office in Washington, DC, and was connected with her. And the rest of the story brings us to this moment in time. Seema's warmth, empathy, compassion, kindness was discovered by me within minutes. She just made me so comfortable and as if she had been waiting for my phone call. So I am not able to welcome you, Seema, with a hug, but I want you to know if I was there, I'd be hugging you. So welcome, Seema.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And thank you, Senator Winfield. I feel really honored to be here and very welcomed. And so I appreciate these kind and wise words from both of you. I wanted to speak. Cindy asked me to speak for about half an hour. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my office and our story, tell you some of our stories, and then hopefully we'll have time for some question and answers. I will start off by saying that though I'm here to talk to you about restorative justice, I wasn't always a believer in restorative justice. I've only actually known much about it for about 6-7 years. And before, when I worked at a foundation in my last job, I'd heard about restorative justice and I was pretty skeptical about it. It seemed to me kind of idiosyncratic and hard to perform, and I couldn't understand why any victims would agree to do it. And so I like to tell the story of why I became a believer in restorative justice. And it starts one day when I first started at my current job at the DC office of the Attorney General at Ballou Senior High School, which is a large public school in Washington, DC. And I was at the school, a woman named Ivy Hilton was holding a restorative justice conference or dialogue at the school, and she invited me to watch it. There had been a fight between 2 high school students, and it wasn't really a fight. It was kind of a pummeling. One boy just beat the lights out of another boy in a classroom, punching him repeatedly in the face, not stopping until a teacher had to pull the boy off of the other one. And when I came to the school on a Monday, it had been a few days because I think that the fight had happened on Friday. But even then, when the smaller boy walked into the conference room in which the facilitator Ivy and I were waiting, you could see his face had still some of the marks of the fight. He had a swollen, cheekbone, and you could see blood red in the white part of his eye. He came in with his mother and his aunt, and I'll call him Darren here for privacy. But when they first came in, they were talking about what happened on Friday. They were very angry and upset. They kept talking about how bad his eye had looked, and he was quiet. And soon thereafter, the other high school boy arrived, and I'll call him Malik, and he came in with his mother and his mother's fiance. And Ivy sat all of us down in chairs, set up in a circle with no table in the middle. And after introductions and ground rules, Ivy, the facilitator, turned to Malik and asked him to tell everyone what happened from the beginning. And now I should say that Malik is way bigger than Darren. He is taller, he's thicker, just seems like a way bigger kid. And this made sense to me. Bigger kid pummels weaker, smaller boy. End of story. But then Malik started talking really softly. He was very quiet. You could almost not hear him, and he was hunched over. He sat kind of awkward, kind of too big for his body, and nervous. And he said, they kept saying my name. He and the other kids, they kept saying my name, but it wasn't my name. It was something else. And so it turned out that they were making fun of his name, that Darren and these other boys had been doing this for weeks and weeks. And sometime on Friday, it seemed to be the last straw. So Ivy then turns to Darren, the other boy, and says, Darren, tell the group what happened. And Darren's like, nothing. I just called his name and he just out of nowhere got up and started punching me in the face. And Ivy then turned to some of the other people in the circle and said, why don't we go around the circle and comment on what we heard Darren saying? and what it makes us think of from our own experiences. And so one of the other adults said, I don't think Darren was telling the full story. Another adult said, when I was younger, people used to make fun of my name and it was hurtful. And then it got to Darren's mother, and she stopped and said, you know, Darren is a joker and he thinks that he's funny, but he doesn't understand how his joking around can cause problems, that it can hurt people and he can get hurt himself. And so we all kind of talked in this circle for an hour and a half. And both the mothers talked about the fact that they didn't raise their children like this, how much they disliked violence. Malik's mother talked about working 2 jobs and having to raise her children, and commuting by bus and having to miss work on Friday when the school called her to pick up her son, and then miss work again today on Monday, and about her boss was going to be mad. When it got to Darren's mother, she told her son, you know, people look at Black boys in Southeast DC and assume that they are violent kids. And she said, I know you're not a violent kid. I just don't want you to end up dead or a number. She started crying. And so the circle went on, and both parents apologized to the other parents for what their sons had done. Malik's mother at some point said to Darren's mother, if I see you on the street, you'll know that you have a friend. But she also said, you know, I heard a lot of rumors about this fight since Friday. I heard that the boy called my son a bee, that your family was going to bring their people to this meeting. And she said, this morning I woke up and I said, Lord help me, I'm going down to Baloo to brawl today. And that's why I brought my fiance with me. And then she said, but now I realize that we've made friends. I don't think this should have happened, but I want to thank these boys for bringing our families together. And now the boys were really uncomfortable. It was really quite hard for Malik to admit what he'd done in front of the person who he'd hurt, and also his family, and in front of his own family. And Darren was forced to admit the role that he and his friends had played in taunting Malik. And it also seemed that the boys didn't often hear their mothers talk openly about their hopes and fears for their sons. And when the moms cried, you could see how painful that was for the boys. But it was the adults around the circle, the community itself, and it wasn't me and it wasn't Ivy, the facilitator, who talked to Malik about how violence was not an appropriate response, but they did so in a way that expressed empathy and compassion towards him. And Malik's mother's fiance at some point mentioned to the group that he goes to a boxing gym, and he offered to take the boys there together. And later we learned that he did do that. And at another point in the 1.5 hours, Darren's aunt started to ask Darren, well, what are you going to do the next time your friends want to tease Malik? And Darren was like, nah, it's not a problem. It'll be fine. But she wouldn't let it go. And she said, no, pretend I'm your friend. And I say, hey, Darren, let's go. Come, let's do this. What are you going to say? And then he said, nah, like in character. It's not like that. He's cool. Don't worry about it. I got this. And they went back and forth several times. They practiced. And towards the end of the conference, the boys each apologized. Ivy made them do it again for a second time with eye contact. The group came to an agreement about what Malik and Darren both had to do, and each promise was written down and signed. They talked about how they would behave when they saw each other in the future, in school and on the street. They talked about how they were going to tell their friends what had happened and how they were going to talk about this incident on social media going forward. And then the agreement was kind of signed and finished, and that was it. We all got up, the moms hugged, the boys did that, you know, nod shoulder thing that they do, and then everyone left. But I was floored because Darren was hurt and with injuries. And in DC, Malik would have been charged with assault. And I'd been a public defender for many years as my first job. So I knew what would have happened to Malik if he had gone to court, like many other of my clients. After the fight at the school, court Malik would have been questioned and handcuffed and arrested in front of his administrators, teachers, students, whoever was around, whoever was peering through the windows. He'd spent a night locked up pending court. And then the next day, from early in the morning, he would be held in a cell block behind the courtroom for hours, until his case was called. And in that time, for a few minutes, he'd be visited by a court-appointed lawyer, someone like me, asking about the details of his life and the details of the crime. And to court Malik, his lawyer is the one person who knows the worst of what he's done. And this is what she'll say to him: we can beat this. The government's evidence isn't that strong. Just don't admit that you did anything. Don't say anything, and I'll do all the talking. And as defense attorneys, we need to do this because we're trying to build trust quickly and show our client and his family that we're on his and their side. And we're investing into a bank account that will pay us back later when we have to have those hard conversations about going to trial or taking a plea. We're also, though, inadvertently undermining what the research shows is fundamental to a person changing his behavior, and that is taking responsibility for his actions. But eventually, Malik's case will be called by a judge, and then the prosecutor, the judge, the probation officer, the defense attorneys, they will all discuss his fate. But none of these people will really know Malik or his family. To them, court Malik will be what they read about on the police report and what I first saw when I met Malik, a large teenage boy who violently assaulted a smaller kid in his class. It's an assault, it's violent, it's a poor Black boy. We've seen this story before. The prosecutor and the judge will never treat Malik as the kid who struggles in school because he's painfully shy and lost his father when he was 8 years old, which he did, and who takes really good care of his younger sister. And the prosecutor will look at court Malik and will think about Darren, the victim. And as a prosecutor, that's his job, to do justice for the victim, Darren, and his mother and the community. And so he will fully prosecute. And back in the courtroom, a probation officer will stand up and read off every worst thing about court Malik in the courtroom as he stands there, restrained at the wrists and at the ankles, in shackles, and in a jumpsuit standing next to his lawyer. The probation officer maybe will say mediocre grades, spotty school attendance, probably hanging out with the wrong crowd. For Malik, at his age, who he is and what he thinks of himself is inordinately influenced by what others think of him. He looks tough and hardened, but Malik's self-esteem is very fragile and his psychological development is vulnerable. And in a courtroom, silenced and ashamed, court Malik will hear what is thought of him by all of these adults. And then he'll deliver. We contribute to stigmatizing these kids. And then they believe what we've told them about themselves, that they are unforgivable, that they are bad, that they are broken. And then we blame them for it. So eventually court Malik will enter a guilty plea. The prosecutor will never know that Malik actually felt terrible right after what he did, that Malik would have taken responsibility for the fight on the first day of court if he could have. At no point will Malik have to apologize directly to Darren, and Darren won't have to apologize for his role either, however minor it was. And when the judge asks him if he committed the crime, Malik's lawyer will lean over to her client, whisper in his ear, and tell him this is the time to say yes in order to take the plea. And so to Malik, none of this will feel like accountability or taking responsibility. And to the victim, it won't feel like justice. Court Malik will return to school and the underlying problem between him and Darren will not have been addressed. In fact, Darren and his friends may now be emboldened or prepared for retaliation. Malik will be the kid who was locked up, who has a PO, who is a criminal. It turns out that the very nature of prosecuting him produces a court Malik who is more wounded and is angrier and is actually more likely to harm again. And we've all seen this happen. But none of this did happen. What actually happened is that two boys and their families resolved the issue with accountability and fairness in a 1.5 hour conversation. So you can see why I was floored. But now my office, the Office of the Attorney General for the District of Columbia, which is the exclusive prosecutor for all juvenile crime in the District of Columbia, has a restorative justice program. In 2017, DC Attorney General Karl Racine launched our program. And since then, a set of full-time restorative justice facilitators who are employed by the prosecutor's office and I have brought together victims of crime and offenders and their respective families and supporters for over 200 restorative justice conferences. We have successfully used restorative justice in stabbing cases, in carjackings, in burglaries, instead of traditional court processing. For a while, our most common cases were low-level, simple assault, low-level robberies, but today we focus on serious violent crime. Our restorative justice caseloads consist of robberies, gun offenses, carjackings, and assaults. And the reason that we take serious violent crime when the victim is interested is because we know that handling those cases with restorative justice is the best shot we have at changing behavior of those youth and reducing recidivism. And it turns out that the research bears this out. The most rigorous research on restorative justice to date is a set of 12 randomized controlled trials that were done in the UK and Australia from 1995 to 2004. This covered over 2,000 cases. And the 12 programs all used restorative justice as an alternative to traditional prosecution, though it was in different sites. And some of the sites involved juveniles, some of them involved adults, and some of them had both. Some of the sites included serious offenses, and some only did nonviolent offenses, and some did both. As a result of all of the analysis, statistically significant findings from the study showed that there is a reduction in recidivism for those who do restorative justice over traditional prosecution. And that's not unusual. There have been many studies, but most of them aren't quite as rigorous, that have shown improved recidivism results. But two important conclusions came out of this massive study of 12 sites. And one is that the recidivism reduction was greater for serious violent crime than it was for nonviolent crime. And the second is that the recidivism reduction was actually greater for adults than it was for juveniles. And an interesting aside, at all of those 12 sites, and this study and the sites were all funded by a single funder, at all of those 12 program sites situated across 2 countries, it was the police officers who facilitated the restorative justice meetings between victims and offenders. So the question is, what is it about restorative justice that is more effective at reducing crime than traditional prosecution? And to me, it's the difference between shame and guilt, which Brené Brown talks about. Shame says, I am a bad person. And guilt says, I did a bad thing. Brené Brown says that shame is highly correlated with things like addiction, depression, self-harm, and violence. But guilt is different. She says guilt is inversely correlated with those things because within guilt, there is a path to redemption built in it. Because you are not the bad thing, so you can try to be better and to make things right. The ability to hold something that we've done or failed to do up against who we want to be is incredibly adaptive and productive. It's uncomfortable. It's hard to face when you've really messed up, but it's actually productive. It's how we learn from our mistakes. And I believe that's the heart of restorative justice. I'll tell another story about a case. We had a case in which a young person tried to rob a woman. She resisted, and in a panic, he shot her, and a bullet grazed her body. So a restorative justice facilitator from my team went to speak to the young person, and he is immediately effusively remorseful. I didn't mean for this to happen. I'm so sorry. Please tell the lady I'm sorry. So then the facilitator meets with and speaks to the woman, and she is scared and she's traumatized. But after thinking about it, she is open to doing restorative justice. So the facilitator works with the victim for a while, but actually she's unable to talk about what actually happened for a while. And usually we don't disclose anything that either side has said to the other. But in this case, the facilitator talked to the boy and asked him permission to tell the woman what he said. And he said yes. So when our facilitator tells the victim that the youth said he wants her to know that he's so sorry and that he hopes she's okay, she breaks down into tears, sobbing. And at this point is finally able to start to talk about what happened to her. Now, this case was unique because this case actually went to disposition or sentencing, which almost none of our cases do, because restorative justice is an alternative to adjudication. But in this case, for various reasons, it was an anomaly. And before the restorative justice dialogue itself was set to happen, the parties all had to go to disposition, and it was during COVID, so it's all virtual. So everyone's there on video. The judge, the lawyers, the restorative justice facilitator, the boy, his mother, the victim, they're all there. And the judge is going through the motions of sentencing and instructs the victim to read her impact statement, her victim impact statement. And it turns out that she had done one at the very beginning of the case with the prosecutor when she had first met the prosecutor. So she pulls out this piece of paper and she starts to read it. And it's a long statement. But at some point, she says in the statement, she reads out, "You should be ashamed of yourself. I hope your mother is ashamed of you. And I hope your father, if you even have a father, is ashamed of you." And then the judge asks the youth if he had anything to say, and he says no. And he didn't read the letter that he had written before the hearing. And later, our restorative justice facilitator called him, and he told her he no longer wanted to do restorative justice. His mom later told the facilitator that when he went back into the juvenile detention facility after leaving the video room that he was in for this hearing, he had to be moved to a new unit, one for youth on suicide watch. And the restorative justice conference never happened. And I tell you this story because even things that we think are innocuous in our court process, even things that we think of as just, like a victim impact statement, they can cause harm and shame when you don't also have the dialogue of accountability and understanding, and when you don't have the redemption. Shame, isolation, and stigma are features of our current justice system. They're not bugs. They are features of how it works. And it turns out that those features actually make us all less safe. They contribute to recidivism. There's new analysis and research on what they call crime desistance, which talks a little bit about why these features are so damaging and increase recidivism. Youth crime follows this age-old trajectory. It's called the age crime curve. And what it means is the vast majority of adolescents and emerging adults will naturally age out of criminal behavior or desist from crime. That's why the curve goes like this. Most of the young people who commit crime are going to age out of committing crime. It's the most durable trend in all of criminology. But desistance is a process. So the decisions to give up crime on that curve and move into a period in your life where you're no longer going to be committing crime, those decisions almost or sometimes involve relapses. It's a lot like addiction before you get to the final point of giving up crime permanently. And so there are things that can promote aging out of crime, the ultimate stopping of criminal behavior, and there are things that can halt it. They can actually make you continue to go in that direction for longer before you stop in that aging out process. And it's different for different people. For instance, parenthood is more strongly linked in the literature to desistance for females, whereas employment and peer influences are more likely to accelerate or disrupt the desistance process for males. And so the research actually tells us what's going on in this process, and it can inform how we deal with crime, and in particular, violent crime. And so the things that accelerate or aid in the process of aging out of crime are shifts in your self-identity, reduced associations with deviant peers, a positive self-image, and growth in self-esteem. And social institutions that are associated with the move to aging out of crime are institutions like employment and religion and pro-social communities like peers and extended family. But there are also things in the research that halt the natural process of aging out of crime, that actually increase the length of a youth's criminality into adulthood. For instance, exposure to deviant peers and a lack of access to resources and support, but also things that halt the natural process of aging out of crime are stigma and shame and resentment. And with respect to resentment, the research says that a sense of injustice and systemic bias can build resentment in our youth and halt the natural process of aging out of crime. Research shows that police arrests and incarceration can trigger mental health issues of stress, anxiety, and depression, especially among our youth of color. And youth who perceive the police and the justice system as unfair or experience bad treatment from police can build anger and resentment and have less respect for law and the police, thereby elongating the process of desistance. Now, studies show that offenders who go through restorative justice see the process as fair and just, and more so than they do the criminal justice system. And so what we're typically doing in our justice system is actually increasing crime. It is slowing the natural aging out of crime for youth. And that makes sense because court is shaming and stigmatizing, and detention puts you in close contact with deviant peers and away from the institutions like school and family that actually promote desistance. And so some people may say, okay, you've got to stop prosecuting kids. And there is some research that supports that. But a lot of us know that that is not possible, at least not now. Not when real harm is being done, not when there are victims and communities that have been hurt or traumatized. And that's why my boss, the DC Attorney General, supports restorative justice. The beauty of restorative justice is that it deals with the crime and the harm that's been caused by the crime. It is about accountability directly to the victim, but it also promotes the things that help kids age out of crime: guilt and remorse, but not shame; accountability, but also redemption. It's a chance for these young people to hold up the terrible thing that they did against the good person who they know they can be, and do things to show progress towards being that person and away from being the terrible thing that you did. When the youth takes responsibility and then does things that the victim asks them to do, he's able to affirm his good core self and juxtapose the bad decision he makes against the person that he wants to be. Because you're not only saying that you're sorry, you're doing sorry. And this helps build a positive self-image. It helps grow your self-esteem. These are the crucial things to the desistance process. So restorative justice helps kids age out of crime. And it also helps youth develop communication and conflict resolution skills. And in our program, when youth are charged with serious violent crime and they go through restorative justice, they're also required to do 10 to 12 weeks of group cognitive behavioral therapy sessions with a community-based therapist. And CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is a proven behavior modification intervention for youth and adults. And in CBT, one of the things they do is they role play situations where they can practice making good decisions in tough situations, where they can build emotional regulation and self-control skills in a positive, pro-social environment. So restorative justice is cultivating the things that help youth move out of the crime curve, while traditional prosecution and incarceration actually accelerate the length of time that a young person will spend time doing crime before stopping. And there, of course, is failure. Even the research on desistance says there will inevitably be a small portion of individuals who will defy the predictions of the age crime curve and remain active in crime later in life. And for some youth in DC, we do prosecute fully, and we do have to take them off the streets and out of communities, but not many. Because when we overpunish, we push the vast majority of youth to commit crime longer. So we must be very careful about the use of our justice system. And also restorative justice doesn't always work. First, we only go forward with the victim's permission. In instances in which the restorative justice conference or the dialogue doesn't work, or the youth doesn't stick to the agreement he promised to, or he doesn't complete the required cognitive behavioral therapy courses, the case just gets handed back to the prosecutor for traditional prosecution. But we've done more than 200 cases, restorative justice conferences, and only about 10 have been returned for prosecution. And not all victims agree to do restorative justice, but when our restorative justice facilitators sit with victims, even those who've been badly hurt, and hear about their pain, and listen to their anger, and walk with them, far more of them than you would ever expect agree in time to do restorative justice. And those who do restorative justice feel more satisfied than those who choose to go to court. And some victims choose to do restorative justice because they are generous and charitable, and they don't want to ruin a kid's life. But some victims choose restorative justice even though they're really angry, because they need something that the court process doesn't give them, as Senator Winfield was talking about. They have to walk around in the world, and they may be worried about seeing the person who hurt them again, or they may be worried about retaliation after prosecution. Often, they want to tell the young person and his family how much they were hurt, and they want to see for themselves if he's truly sorry for what he did. Some victims are baffled about why it happened and have questions that they need answered, or they're worried that they were targeted and want to know if they were, or they've since changed their lives to avoid the bus or the metro or the neighborhood or all teenagers, and they need healing. In that massive 12-site restorative justice study, the main researcher studied surveys of victims of those hundreds of cases. And the conclusion that they found was that the anger and the fear and the raw emotion of the victim about how they were hurt, and that experience of the offender watching that and hearing from them and then having to apologize to that person, these were the critical emotional transformative events that impacted the victims and helping them feel less fear and less anger and less need for retaliation, but also helping the person who committed the harm build empathy. And in DC, our initial analysis shows recidivism reduction, but we've also launched our own randomized controlled trial to gauge recidivism outcomes more rigorously. But since the very beginning, we've been doing victim satisfaction surveys, and they have consistently shown like 95% of victims would recommend the process to a friend, 90% would do it again themselves if they were in a similar situation. We give victims of crime a choice. We say you can choose the traditional route of prosecution or restorative justice. And even if you choose restorative justice, you can change your mind and not give up anything. And some victims choose prosecution, but most victims choose an option that makes them feel safe and allows them to regain trust in the world after their trust is frayed. And what I've seen is that in my office, prosecutors have come to understand this, because after a prosecutor sits in on a restorative justice circle, he will refer more cases, including more serious cases, to restorative justice instead of prosecution. And many times we invite an observer to sit in and absorb a restorative justice conference if we get permission from the participants. And sometimes it's a prosecutor or a judge or a probation officer. And they say things like, I can't believe that after the trauma of crime, people can see each other as human beings and come to a resolution. One restorative justice conference I observed for one of our facilitators went on for a couple of hours, and at the end, the victim, who'd been so badly hurt that he had to go through surgery, said that hearing from the youth made him feel so much better because it made him realize that the world was not all that bad. I feel like we are public servants who are empowered with the duty to make things better for the public, both victims and offenders. And our juvenile justice system and our adult justice system should have one single goal, and that is to help the people learn from their mistakes and stop committing crime. But instead, we're making things worse. At every juncture, we stigmatize, we shame, and we dehumanize. And we don't even help victims find closure or heal. And we have to acknowledge that we're doing this. We must go back to kind of first principles. How can we help young people learn from their mistakes and stop future crime? Well, restorative justice is one of the ways. And New Zealand's entire juvenile justice system is restorative. Is it hard? Yes. Is it the answer for everything? No. And will some youth fail? Of course. But in Washington, D.C., we are dealing with serious, violent youth crime with restorative justice. and we are getting better outcomes for victims and better outcomes with recidivism. And so I think you should do that too.
Seema, thank you so much. We are blessed. What a gift to have you talk to us. I mean, we could listen to you for hours. One of my questions, and of course we do have questions in the Q&A, are you able to tell us a little bit about what you'll be doing in 2022?
Yes, of course. We're so excited because our counterpart to Senator Winfield, the chair of our Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C., at the request of my boss, the DC Attorney General, this past budget cycle just increased the budget for our restorative justice program by double. And so we have the ability to increase our capacity dramatically. And the City Council was interested in us doing a couple of things. One thing that we've been really eager to do is to expand our juvenile justice program within the juvenile justice program, the juvenile justice system. So we hopefully will be able to offer restorative justice to all victims of crime, which we can't do quite yet with our staffing. We have currently about 7 restorative justice facilitators. But we're also going to be moving into taking referrals from our adult prosecutor, the U.S. Attorney's Office, for 18 to 24-year-old young adults charged with crime. And we anticipate being able to receive that strata of crime that is kind of low felonies on the adult side, robberies and assaults, which we are eager to do because we are convinced that restorative justice can offer a lot for young adults as it does for juveniles.
So one of the comments is that I'd like to share with you about how stunningly powerful your talk has been.
Oh, thank you.
This person feels incredibly lucky to be moving to DC soon.
Oh, excellent.
So she wants to know, how do we get this going? Like everywhere. Like, how do we grow restorative justice?
You know, I feel like there is more and more of a hunger for restorative justice now than there ever has been. What we saw, you know, in our city, our adult prosecutors, the U.S. Attorney's Office, it's the federal arm of government because of the weird nature of Washington, D.C. And that office has historically been somewhat resistant to reform efforts. They're kind of traditional, more punitive law and order prosecutors. And we had been trying to make inroads with them for years with restorative justice and just had not been able to do that. But after the murder of George Floyd and the protests of the summer, a group of young prosecutors or new prosecutors at that office started to agitate for reform themselves and wrote an open letter to their leadership asking for reforms, one of which was to build restorative justice into their diversion programming, which was amazing to us. And since then, there's been consistent and growing support in that office for restorative justice, which is, you know, it's like baffling to me. I can't believe it, but I think it, and I get calls often from places around the country where people are looking to think about restorative justice and start a program. And I think it's because now there is more of a sense that there are deep, pervasive problems in the way that we do justice that are systemic. And they really stem from the fact that our criminal justice system has in its roots some of the state violence of slavery and Jim Crow and lynchings and all of these things, and that you can't extricate this kind of systemic bias from this system. But there aren't very good answers about how do you deal with crime if you don't use this justice system. But I think restorative justice is one of the answers, and that's what people are looking to. And I think that what the best thing that somebody could do is to talk to local elected officials about wanting restorative justice. I think it should be a part of the debates around policing and justice and racism and white supremacy, because it addresses some of those things.
Thank you so much. Senator Winfield, would you like to comment?
Oh, yeah. I don't have much to add. I think that was a great answer. I do think that, education like what we're doing tonight is important. And creating a conversation in a different way. All of these conversations that I tend to have focus on whether or not we care about the victims or not. And I think when you listen to what Seema is saying and people who talk about restorative justice, you get the sense that this is not what some people think of as just trying to be soft on the people who committed a crime, but to think about all of the players and the parts and how they work together and how our system actually, in saying that it's working for those who have been victimized, does things that leave them in the space where they were. And I think when people begin to realize what this is, because I've known a lot of people who are like, I don't want to do that restorative justice thing. And then when you talk to them, they don't know what it is, right? Mm-hmm. So when people are more aware of what's actually occurring and what you are seeking to do and what it can actually do for the people they say that they are there for, I think we're more likely to have a more robust system. It's not that we don't do any of the practices, right? But I think we'll have a more robust system than we currently have.
And I was so surprised by the what your talk around desistance. And rather than allowing kids to age out, we're doing exactly the opposite. We're keeping them in. So I thought that we have so many questions, Seema. I just wanted to tell everybody, we try to break a little after 8. I mean, we're supposed to have a hard cut probably at 8 p.m., but we're going to go with Seema and Senator Winfield's permission to about 8:15 before we cut out. Is that okay, Senator?
Yeah, that's actually fine. And let me just say, I don't mean to violate things, but I just sort of conversation about how do we get more funding. I think that answer I just gave about having this conversation, if we can use the conversation to get buy-in for people at the level where I am, where funding comes from, that's how you move in that direction. So that's why I think this education is important.
Okay, so let me start. The first question, and Manny, it's good to see you. Do you know how much work was done behind the scenes in terms of the preparation for the circle? Or rather, how much work is done on a regular basis behind the scenes on cases like the ones mentioned?
It's a great question. Our facilitators meet with all of the parties before they would schedule a restorative justice circle. So the way that we operate is we first actually speak to the young person charged with the offense, because we want to gauge if that person is willing and able to take responsibility for the behavior, the crime first. And they do this under the cloak of really tight confidentiality policies that protect anything anybody says, so that it won't be used against them if the process breaks down and they end up going through the regular court process. And those policies were written by our office, which is the prosecutor. They bind our office, but they're respected by all of the parties. So we first talk to the young person. Well, we first talk to the defense attorney to get permission, and then to the parent, and then we talk to the young person. Central to this is that our facilitators are building trust and rapport with all of the people. That's a critical part of this. And so all of these interactions are opportunities for them to build trust and to, we say we're not pro-respondent or pro-victim, we're pro-everyone, to let everyone know that we are supportive of all of their healing. And so our facilitators will speak to the young person and then go speak to the person who's been victimized to see if that person is interested in participating in restorative justice. And if both sides are interested, then our facilitators will usually meet with them and then their supporters and family several more times before they actually schedule the restorative justice conference. So it could be a month from the time which they speak to all the parties and get the green light to do restorative justice. And sometimes it's like 3 months. So it does sometimes take a long time. That's maybe because people's schedules are hard to coordinate, or our facilitator wants to spend more time with the young person to help them feel more comfortable and, practice and let them, go through the process of explaining what they did and speaking with their family members and preparing their family members. But the process actually doesn't take any longer than the process of going through prosecution and trial.
And okay, I think Margaret is an attorney. Have any of the studies compared the success of the restorative justice process for those juveniles whose parents had criminal records to those whose parents did not?
I have not read that in any studies that I have read, and we don't ask family members about their prior criminal record. One thing I can tell you that I think bears noting is that almost all of the young people who we see, and now we currently do restorative justice for almost exclusively young people who've been involved in serious violent crime, including gun crimes. And to the one, once our facilitators get to know them and their family members and build trust and make sure that they feel safe enough to speak about what they did, feel, they can be that vulnerable, they end up learning about things that have happened to these young people that are super traumatic. Like, I think almost every child that has been through our program has instances of some sort of trauma in their background. And trauma can be, they've had a loved one be the victim of gun violence, a parent who's been incarcerated, they've experienced homelessness, they've been through the neglect system, they've been in and out of foster care. There's so many, they've been the victim of violence themselves. It's heartbreaking how often we hear these stories, because the whole team meets together and we brainstorm every case before it goes to conference. We moot the cases before they go to conference to help the facilitator prepare. And inevitably, part of the preparation is talking about the young person and what they've been through. And almost every time you see just enormous trauma in their backgrounds. I guess it's not surprising then that they're lashing out in these ways.
How long have you been doing restorative justice out of your office? How long did it take to get buy-in from those that have been part of the system?
Well, I was lucky to come into my office when my boss was newly elected as the Attorney General, and he campaigned on a platform of juvenile justice reform. So he was very primed and open to innovation like restorative justice, and was very, very supportive of it. So we had support at a very high level from the very beginning. So we started a little bit in 2016, we got staff in 2017, and we've grown since then. The better question, which is part of this, is how long did it take to get buy-in from the kind of institutional people at the prosecutor's office? And that took a lot longer. And in my mind, that happened in part because we put our restorative justice program in the prosecutor's office, that we worked alongside prosecutors, that we saw them every day, that we worked with them, and we could build trust with them. And then we could invite them to sit in and observe our restorative justice conferences, because for a while, there was not very much buy-in. There was a ton of pushback. And it was nice to have leadership from the top say publicly, I support restorative justice, and for people to know that that was what they were supposed to do. But there's also, culture change is hard, really hard. I think it was aided by the fact that we were sitting with the facilitators. And, one thing that was important to me was that we hired people who could build trust with the kids in the juvenile justice system and their families quickly. And so they had kind of cultural relevance, and they looked like the communities that were going through our justice system. And some of the facilitators that we hired themselves had been through the justice system. And that actually changed the makeup of the office. So people who were prosecutors were working with people who were formerly justice involved, and that I think help to kind of build bridges and help people see that there is value to this.
Once a person goes through the process, there is no criminal record. Is that correct? Or what do you do about that?
It is almost always correct. We have a provision for some cases where we ultimately defer to the prosecutor, but the culture and the expectation from all of their supervisors and management is that in almost all of the cases, in most cases, the prosecution is held in abeyance. And if the young person successfully completes restorative justice, which includes whatever they promised to do for the victim, and they complete, in our cases, the cognitive behavioral therapy, because that's a requirement with serious violent crime, then at the completion of all of those things, then the case is dismissed and there's no conviction, no juvenile adjudication. There are some cases where you have young people with very lengthy records or very severe, very significant crimes where the prosecutor will not give them the opportunity to have their case dismissed, but will give a really beneficial plea offer so that the adjudication will be significantly less than it would otherwise. And that has to happen. So our prosecutors, this is where we got the most pushback. Our prosecutors have to heavily incentivize doing restorative justice, because otherwise no kid wants to talk to the victim who they hurt and tell them what they did. Nobody. I don't want to do it. When I hurt somebody, I don't want to go to them and tell them that I hurt them. That sucks. And no defense attorney is going to be like, yeah, just take my client and have them speak about whatever they want, and we'll just cross our fingers and hope that the victim asks for things that are reasonable. There's a lot of loss of control for defense attorneys. So we got pushback from the defense bar also. And so in order, what we would tell our prosecutors and what their supervisors and my boss would tell the prosecutors is, we believe restorative justice is better for victims, and we believe that it reduces recidivism. And if we believe that, then we need to do what we need to do to get the kids to take that option. And that means incentivizing the cases. And so typically with serious violent crime, you don't have an opportunity to have the case dismissed. But because that opportunity is given, every defense attorney will say, you have to take that opportunity. And every parent says, yeah, you have to do this. And the kids, grudgingly do it.
Here's a rather long comment and question, but we've got some restorative schools in the state. So one question that was posed is, in restorative justice, do you support removing SROs from schools?
It's a good question. I actually, I think it's a complicated issue, SROs. I think that we've had this discussion, this debate in Washington, D.C. recently, and I tend to be the person who would support taking police out of schools and school resource officers out of schools. But I've also heard from principals and parents in some schools where there's just a really high level of crime in the community, that they want to keep their SROs in their schools, or at least around the schools. And these are good people who want their kids to go to school and be safe. And I understand that too. I think that restorative justice in schools takes a long time to develop. Like, you have to put a lot of investment into really transforming the school to be a restorative school, because you need to do restorative circles, not only when there's a discipline problem, but every day before that, right? To build community and to build practice and doing restorative justice. And when you do that, the culture of the school and the community gets stronger. This is what I understand from schools that have done this, a couple in DC, but a lot in like Colorado and California. They have really dramatically dropped their rates of suspension and expulsion and those kind of things. And in those schools, they have been able to really viably not have SROs in the schools at all. But it does take It does take time. The school that I talked about at the very beginning of my presentation, Blue, they brought restorative justice trainers into the school for a year and a half. And they weren't able to change the culture of the school in that time. And then a new principal came and kind of stopped that process. And I think it takes a few years and a lot of resources to do it, unfortunately. But ideally, if restorative justice really flourishes, the whole disciplinary conversation would change in a way that would make it very viable to not have SROs in the school.
So I'm going to ask this, and I know it's a conversation for another day, but Seema spoke of the use of restorative justice in cases of violent crimes in DC. Are offenses of a sexual nature not considered for an RJ process there?
We have taken sexual harm cases for a little while. This is fascinating. It was prosecutors who asked us to take these cases. It took us a long time to build trust and support from prosecutors, but at some point, there were some prosecutors who are the ones who were asking us to do more types of restorative justice. And it took us some time to build experience and expertise and get the training to take low-level sexual harm cases. And we were doing those a lot for a while. And we have taken a couple of serious sexual harm cases and facilitated with those with the support of a restorative justice facilitator from outside of our office who had expertise in those kind of cases and were coached by that person. Currently, because we're trying to use all of our capacity to support this study, this randomized control trial, we had to kind of draw a box around the cases that were eligible for this evaluation and that we're taking. And so that box includes serious violent crime, but does not include serious sexual harm cases. But we have taken a couple.
So Senator Winfield, what would you tell me and others? Everybody's ramped up now and you know, can we get an appointment with you Monday at 9 or, you know, should we all write you letters? What would you suggest to get this going? And we need funding and grassroots organizing and.
Yeah, don't write me letters and send me a bunch of calls.
You're gonna say that.
Again, I think people have to understand what this is, and the people that are really talking about right now are the legislators who have to have the buy-in so that they can say it makes sense to allocate the money to programs like this, to grow them larger, to be able to do more of this. And that's going to require people who think that what we're doing in Connecticut needs to be bigger. That think that what they heard tonight needs to be more of what we do, not just for juveniles, but across our systems. And so, yes, you're going to have to write letters, but I think you're going to have to invest some time in being able to tell a story of what this means. The letter is great, and many of my colleagues who have opposed a lot of the things that I've done that I think that people on this call would be in favor of have gotten a lot of letters. What they often don't get is the story of the impact. And again, I think when almost all of us go out talking about how we want people to be safer and we're concerned about what happens with victims, you need to give them a story that talks about that so that if they make the choice you want them to make, they can tell that story back and explain why they did that. So that's hard work. As I say to you, Cindy, none of this stuff is going to happen as fast as we want it to and probably need it to. We need it to have happened yesterday. But it's work that we all do involve ourselves in.
So it's 8:20. We have many more questions in the Q&A. You know, we've already surpassed our time. We were supposed to do a hard cut at 8:15. Representative Terry Wood, I don't know if you're still on, but thank you. I understand you're a huge advocate for restorative justice. We'll be in touch. And I want to remind everybody that Senator Winfield, do you see any other questions that are critical that we answer tonight? I want to remind everybody.
You have to make that judgment.
Well, there's so many. That Seema will be back on January 25th, and we will be spotlighting on the restorative justice for sexual harm that night with two other great speakers and Senator Winfield, and that'll be our last webinar for before the legislative season. And so we're going to release Senator Winfield so he can go do his day job and night job, and our legislature starts probably around February 5th. So do you see anything else, Gary?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to respect the time that people commit to us. But let me just say this. We're working on these issues all the time. And while you might not have gotten your question answered here, I am happy to engage with anyone who contacts me, whether they're a constituent or not, and have more conversation, because I know that it may lead to the place where we want to be. So if your question wasn't answered, I'm not going to make a judgment about which one we should answer. I think we should answer them all. We just don't have time. So reach out to me. I can be reached at gary.winfield@cga.ct.gov, gary.winfield@cga.ct.gov. Or you can go on social media and find Gary Winfield, and I respond to all my social media. So Twitter, Facebook, it doesn't matter. I will respond to all of it. Thank you for being here. It's an important conversation. LinkedIn, I don't use LinkedIn. That's the one I don't use the most, but I will go there.
I left you an invite. Yeah. So I just wanted to tell everybody something. We've got our nonprofit One Standard of Justice, and something we've been trying to get traction on is restorative justice in the state, getting some real leaders of the movement together at a table, grassroots organizing, different social justice and criminal justice issues, coming together to drive it. And maybe at by January 25th, we'll be ready to announce a new organization that will do just that. So it's in the works. I want to thank Noemi and Sam Diamond for being with us and being the people behind the scenes. Noemi really worked on not only the video we saw tonight, but another video that will be premiering based on former restorative justice webinars in the first half of this year. And Seema, I love you. And I'm hoping that now that Gary Winfield has identified that he's the, what are you, Gary, the chair of the appropriations for criminal justice, that the Judiciary Committee, that will be able to bring you into our state, because we're going to need some big guns helping us. So
I'm excited for you all. Thank you. I'm happy to help in any way that you need.
Do you have any final words that you'd like to say to us?
I dropped into the chat the link to this DOJ report on desistance that I tried to talk a little bit about, but it's a lot more complicated than what I said. It goes into a lot more aspects of desistance. So if you're interested, that's in the chat.
Okay, so I thank everybody. I'm sorry not all your questions got answered. This is the beginning of something that will grow and grow. So thank you so much. Good night, Senator Winfield. Good night, Seema, Sam, Noemi, Jeff, and everybody. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Cindy, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
In touch.
Bye-bye.